As a royal daughter, Elizabeth was of great importance as the giving of her hand could seal an alliance. Unfortunately, teenage Elizabeth was married to a child. A child wasn't going to match her freak, but the king's big brother certainly would.
Once upon a time in history.
Hello, history nerds. Welcome back to Once Upon a Time in History. And today I've got a 14th century royal scandal. Before Brad cheated on Jen and before Arnold Schwarzenegger had a kid with his housekeeper, there was Elizabeth of Lancaster, a royal princess. Can't condone cheating, but at the same time I do like finding women in history who had a bit of agency. So let me introduce you to Elizabeth. A royal entrance. Elizabeth was likely born in the early months of 1363 in Burford, Shropshire, England. Despite much searching, I haven't been able to find where precisely in Burford she was born. There was once a castle, sometimes known as Richard's Castle, but this was unlikely to have been part of her father's lands. Speaking of her father was John of Gaunt, and sometimes in modern day you may hear him referred to as the Red Prince, which is a reference to the fact that his older brother was known as the Black Prince. Elizabeth's mother had been Blanche of Lancaster, and Blanche had been a very wealthy heiress, so John had definitely punched well when he married her. Through both parents, Elizabeth could claim descendancy from Henry III, so she was quite blue-blooded, though her parents weren't too closely related that they would have needed a papal dispensation as to get married. The couple descended from different sons of Henry III, with John of Gaunt descending from his first son Edward I and Blanche descending from the second son, Edmund Crouchback. Elizabeth was raised in her father's household under the guardianship of Catherine Swynford, and Catherine is quite important to Elizabeth's life because Catherine was more likely a mother figure than Blanche, though this wasn't Blanche's fault, because in 1368 she passed away, and at this time Elizabeth was just 4 to 5 years old. Elizabeth would share her childhood with her elder sister Philippa, who was older by about 4 years, and these sisters could not have been more different. Philippa is said to have been quite serious, while our Elizabeth was described as a headstrong and spirited young woman. For much of it, they were also joined by their younger brother Henry. Not much else is known about Elizabeth's youth, but in 1380, when she was 16 to 17 years old, Elizabeth was called to perform her duties as a daughter. The little husband. We can't help but wonder how Elizabeth felt when she found out she was to wed John Hastings, the 3rd Earl of Pembroke. When we look back at nobles in history, it's quite common for us to find older men marrying little girls. But it's not so common for us to find examples such as Elizabeth's case, where we have a 16, 17-year-old girl marrying an 8-year-old little boy. But all we can do is wonder, because Elizabeth's opinions on this marriage haven't survived, but perhaps her actions tell us enough. But back to the marriage itself. Hastings was a ward of John of Gaunt, so Elizabeth and him were familiar with each other, and he had been a ward of John since age 3 when his father passed away. Gaunt probably chose this marriage for Elizabeth as he had higher aspirations for his eldest daughter Philippa, who would go on to become the Queen Consort of Portugal. Due to Hastings' age, this was just a wedding ceremony. There was no bedding ceremony. There would not be. Though Hastings would move into John of Gaunt's household, Elizabeth would be moved out. With her new lavish title of Countess of Pembroke, Elizabeth was given her own household, and then she was moved to the royal court. According to the Westminster Chronicler, this was so she could study the behaviour and customs of courtly society. Joining the royal court, she may have been accompanying or joining her younger brother Henry, and we know this because in the following years he is recorded to have been a part of the royal household of Richard II. While this change would still be stressful and exciting for Elizabeth, it's important to note that she wasn't travelling too far away from home. This is because the royal court during this period was mainly at Westminster Palace. And Westminster Palace wasn't too far away from what was then the Savoy Palace, which was located on the Strand. John of Gaunt's household would have moved around. They had accommodation in various locations. So for Elizabeth, it may have been like just moving down the road. As part of the royal court, Elizabeth would have become very familiar with notable figures when it comes to late 14th century politics and events. But one of these would very much change the direction of her life. Introducing the lawless Constable. John Holland was not unfamiliar with royal scandal. In fact, he was the fruit of a royal scandal. His mother, Joan of Kent, a granddaughter of Edward I, had married a man named Thomas Holland, John's father, and then proceeded to marry another man. She had committed bigamy. But that is a story for another day. All you need to know is that his father passed away and his mother remarried Edward of Woodstock, also known as the Black Prince. Together, they'd had a son named Richard, who was now King of England. As there is an excessive amount of Johns in this story, we'll be calling John Holland Holland from now on. As the king's youngest older half-brother, Holland became the Constable of the Tower, which, to simplify his job role, he was essentially the boss of the tower whenever Richard wasn't there. And in this position of power, he was able to show his true levels of depravity. The most infamous example of this comes from 1385, when a friar came to Richard II and reported that his uncle John of Gaunt, that's Elizabeth's father, was planning to kill the king. When the friar refused to reveal his sources, Richard sent the friar to the Tower of London into the care of Holland, where Holland tortured the friar to death. Sources can't agree if the king ordered Holland to torture the friar to death if he did not reveal his sources. But he did, and the torture included cooking the friar. Along with cruelty, Holland was also known for his many dalliances with women. In fact, he had had a dalliance with a woman that Elizabeth was very familiar with. And that woman was Isabella of Castile, and she was both Elizabeth's step-aunt and her aunt by marriage. Isabella was the sister of Elizabeth's stepmother Constance and the wife of Elizabeth's uncle Edmund of Langley. And this affair was very public. This was very humiliating for Edmund of Langley, and this wasn't the only time she would be unfaithful. Holland was essentially a 14th century Errol Flynn. He was in like Flynn, and he also liked them young. Because remember, Elizabeth was 17 when she joined the royal court, and at the time, Holland was 28. We don't know precisely when they met. In fact, it is quite possible that they were already familiar with each other. Remember, Elizabeth is a cousin of the king and John is his older brother. Just a year after Elizabeth joined the royal court, there was the Peasants' Revolt, also known as Wat Tyler's Rebellion. If you are extremely familiar with the Wat Tyler's Rebellion, you will know that this was the only time the Tower of London was breached. The peasants made it inside, and a very famous story about when they got in was that Elizabeth's younger brother, Henry, was hidden in a wardrobe. But we don't know for certain where Elizabeth was at the time of the revolt. The writer Anne O'Brien gave us a beautiful image in her historical fiction novel The King's Sister. In her novel, she shows that Elizabeth was in the tower and she was saved by Holland. It can be assumed that Elizabeth was a part of the royal court, so there is a chance she was still in the tower just like her little brother. But we don't know for sure. She may have been visiting family. We don't know where she was at the time. We don't know what precisely she was doing between 1380 and 1386. But we can assume one thing, and that's that Elizabeth of Lancaster and John Holland, Duke of Exeter, had become extremely close. As he had many times before, John Holland had shot his love arrow and he'd hit the target. He was in like Flynn, but this time he was going to leave evidence. The fruit of love. If the lovers' affair wasn't already public knowledge, in around the spring of 1386 it would have to become known. Why? Elizabeth was pregnant. And guess what? It wasn't her little husband, who was 13 at this time. Naturally, John of Gaunt was incredibly upset with his daughter, but he does seem to have been lenient with her. There's no recording of the Duke of Lancaster just exploding with rage over his daughter's circumstances. But it would leave John with no choice. He would have to apply to have his daughter's marriage annulled. There is a possibility that the marriage had actually already been dissolved, but the circumstances of this aren't known, and it's more commonplace to believe that the marriage of Hastings and Elizabeth ended due to Elizabeth's affair and pregnancy. Elizabeth and John were married on the 24th of June 1386, and within the next 6 months they would welcome their firstborn child, who they named Richard. This was a rather short episode, but thank you so much for listening to what is my second episode of my podcast, Once Upon a Time in History. As promised, I will be making the next episode a her story, a follow-on from my TikTok series. And the focus will be Mary de Bohun, or de Bohun, it's up to you. And she was the mother of Henry V. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know that you enjoyed it. And if you're not following this podcast, you need to follow me. So the next episode will be out in a few weeks' time, but if you can't wait until then, just find me on TikTok. I'm History on Crack, but also Once Upon a Time in History. See you next episode in another point in history.
Once upon a time in history.